Morning, sir.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Hi, Miss Kelly. I haven't seen you in forever, so.
Trying to keep from turning around.
No. It is on the screen over here. Well,
Toast. Colin and I found a new place in Nashville. Have you ever heard of House Cards?
I've heard of it.
Oh, yes. Isn't that good?
That's
They got
awesome.
the
I've
high-
heard great things about
Oh,
it. I'd like to go. It's real fancy.
it is very fancy. It's sort of like that speakeasy. You have to go down and let in. You have to know where you're going. You can't get to it. I mean, there's no.
I'm trying to get a picture of you, but that's your picture of me.
Well, I handed to him.
Oh.
He was like playing with it.
They have their microphone.
You did as well.
can you hear us now? Jeff,
Yes.
good? Hi. Kelly, good? Everybody good? Well, thank you guys for joining us. We're excited to be here to this town hall event with our Congressman John Rose to talk about small business and how things are progressing in the Upper Cumberland. So what I'd like to do is to start off with introductions on everyone that is here with us and that people that are on live. So Mr. Mark Farley, if you would introduce yourself and go around the room.
I'm Mark Farley, the Executive Director of the Upper Cumberland Development District. Glad to be here today.
I'm Megan Smith. I'm with the Small Business Development Center.
I am Tyler Asher. I'm with the Small Business Development Center.
I'm Rip Akers with 1 Hour Martin Housing here in Cookville. Been here in business for 31 years.
Jeff Brown.
I'm Jeff Brown. I'm the president and founder of the Biz Foundry Entrepreneur Center in Cookville and serving the Upper Cumberland area.
Kelly.
Hi, I'm Kelly. I'm the founder of Lenny and Eva, a women's fashion accessory brand based out of Baxter, Tennessee.
And our guest of the hour.
Good morning. I'm John Rose, and it's my privilege to represent the 6th District of Tennessee in the U.S. House of Representatives.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you for taking the time to come and do this with us and talk about what's happening in DC. So let's just go ahead and jump right in, if that's all right with everybody. Let's talk about some legislative updates on the DC side, Congressman Rose.
Sure. Well, again, it's a privilege to be with you today, and to all those listening in, thank you for the opportunity to represent you in Washington. As you probably all are aware, the 6th District of Tennessee is made up of 19 counties, all of 17, and part of 2 reaches from Robertson County on the western end all the way across to Pickett in the east along the Kentucky-Tennessee state line, and then down to Coffee County in the south, and 713,928 people in that area by the 2010 census. So a large area geographically and a diverse area in terms of the economy and the interests of the counties across that span. I've been in office. This is my first opportunity to serve in elected office, and have just finished up 20 or 19 months, I guess, more precisely in the 20th month of very interesting times, to say the least, for the country, and interesting times to be in Washington. As you know, I am a Republican, and so at present, as a Republican, I'm in the minority in the House of Representatives. The Democrats hold the majority. Nancy Pelosi, as Speaker, controls the agenda of the House of Representatives, and that's been a real education for me, entering Congress and serving in the minority. One of the things I've learned is that the majority rules in Washington, and particularly in the House of Representatives. So the majority party controls, through its Speaker, the agenda. They control what legislation we hear and when we hear it, and how much debate is allowed on it. So that's been the context of serving in Washington over the last 19 months. I could talk a lot about that, but unfortunately, I came to Washington. Well, it's not unfortunate that I came to Washington, I hope, but I came to Washington with the hope that as a business person who has spent my career, making deals with customers and suppliers and solving problems, not unlike probably everyone listening in today, that I could bring those skills to Washington and help solve problems. Unfortunately, the 116th Congress that I serve in, governed by Speaker Pelosi, the Democratic Party has not been in a compromising mood. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think they've lost a great opportunity over the last year and a half to move things forward for our country. Instead, they have had 2 primary focuses, frankly, and 2 kind of buckets I will put what we've done for the last 2 years in. Number one, they have been pursuing the president. So we spent the vast majority of last year in one way or another pursuing the president. The first half of the year, they were waiting on the Mueller report and trying to set the stage for that. When that came back and didn't provide them with the context they needed for impeachment, they were in a malaise for a few weeks until they found a new nail to hang their hat on, I suppose you could say. And then they spent the last half of the year pursuing the investigation around the Ukrainian telephone call, obviously leading ultimately to impeachment, and then to a trial in the Senate that didn't get wrapped up until early February. And the unfortunate part about that is that just a lot of time and energy and the attention of the U.S. House focused on that. The second area of focus, frankly, for the Democrats has been on advancing hyper-partisan agenda items that, frankly, play perhaps very well to the base of the Democratic Party, but are not really aimed at solving the fundamental problems of the country or addressing the issues that we could spend time addressing. And so that's been very unfortunate. I know that I'm speaking of it in a way that sounds very political, but that's just been the reality. So the They have not invited debate. There has not been, a real opportunity for input, for give and take in the House. All of that has been happening on the Senate side. And I say all of that to kind of set the stage for what I'm going to say next, which is to address kind of the current legislative agenda in Washington as we sit here in mid-August. And the bad news I have to report is that, as you know, and if you're watching the news media, you know that discussions around the next leg of coronavirus legislation has been stalled now for many weeks, but in particular, I guess in a most pronounced way for the last 2 or 3 weeks, with the Democrats kind of pinning their hopes to the legislation that the House passed back in mid-May called the HEROES Act, which is a monolithic piece of legislation, $3.5 trillion in federal spending attached to that. Some of it aimed at coronavirus directly, some of it aimed very loosely at coronavirus, much of it having nothing to do with the response to coronavirus. And so, and it's dead on arrival in Washington. I don't think that you're going to see anything like that ever become law, but they've been kind of stuck on that point and refusing to negotiate in the Senate, which is where the negotiation, if any, will happen, is happening. And that's been true of virtually all the coronavirus relief legislation, is that it has come out of the Senate. And so that's where we stand today. You saw the president a week and a half ago, really out of frustration, attempt to take some executive action aimed at providing further relief across a number of areas. Frankly, his capacity to implement meaningful relief measures on his own is very limited. In fact, the things that were done a week and a half ago, the executive actions that were taken by the president, I think are all, to one degree or another, either suspect in their in the ability of the administration to actually deliver them, or limited in terms of their scope. So, for example, we saw a move to extend unemployment benefits from the federal level, but it requires some state engagement, and it's not clear exactly how far that can go without the Congress taking action. You saw some short-term relief, I guess I would describe it, on the payroll tax front. However, it is only a deferral of payroll tax payments, not a forgiveness of those or removal of those obligations. It's just a deferral of when the payments have to be made. So limited impact there, and then some other modest actions on the student loan front and elsewhere. So as we sit here today, I'm not sure when there will be another meaningful bill to present itself in the House or in the Congress around coronavirus relief. Obviously, we've done a lot, and some of those programs are still unfolding and being implemented and flowing down to provide relief. But there certainly are some areas where adjustments are needed. And so hopefully the stalemate will be broken at some point. Though I must tell you, with respect to everything else in Washington right now, I think that you will see very little happen between now and the election. I expect there'll be a temporary budget or temporary appropriations measures that will pass sometime before or around September 30th, and to get us past the election. And then I think all the heavy lifting will be done after the election in December, which is the same way we operated last year. So just to recap last year again, go back to that, all of the meaningful legislation that passed the House of Representatives in 2019 passed in a 2.5-week period in December. We passed the National Defense Authorization Act. We passed the main appropriations bills for the year, and we ratified the USMCA trade agreement, and we voted on the impeachment of the president, all in that 2.5-week period. All of the rest of the work of the year, frankly, was relatively meaningless compared to that. And that's not to say there weren't some important measures that had passed throughout the year, but the big items all passed. I think that's what's going to happen again this year. I'll pivot just for a moment and talk about the legislation that I think needs to pass. I think we have learned a lot over the last 4 or 5 months about coronavirus and COVID-19. My own very strong belief is that we have learned that the real impact of the virus is on a fairly narrow set of the population. In other words, we know who the vulnerable people are that are most impacted by COVID-19. And frankly, I believe we need to focus all of our extraordinary attention on helping those people stay safe and on giving them the resources they need to make it through this period. The rest of us, frankly, need to get back to work, including, I believe, getting back to school. If we focused our attention on, for example, skilled nursing facilities, nursing homes, and on the elderly population and those with pre-existing conditions that are most impacted by COVID-19, I think we would see a far better result. We had the advantage coming into this essentially government-imposed shutdown of the economy of being in the best economy in the history of the country, I would argue. Certainly the best economy in my lifetime, as I think you all would probably mostly agree. The lowest unemployment rate in my lifetime, I'm 55, the lowest unemployment rate among minorities, women, and youth in the history of the country, in the history of records being kept on those statistics. And so we need to get back to that. It's important that we get back to that as quickly as possible, to the extent that we extenuate or extend this period of shutdown. I think we're at greater risk of doing lasting harm to the economy. And so I, for one, advocate strongly that we get back to work. I think Tennessee is in a fairly good place relative to much of the rest of the country. I think our leaders have handled it. Our state and local leaders have handled this fairly well under the circumstances. And as a result, I think Tennessee stands to bounce back quicker than many other places around the country. And certainly the U.S., I think, has the possibility of bouncing back quicker than other countries around the world. And so I think we need to seize that opportunity and take advantage of that chance to come back quickly and get our economy back on track. And I know that's a lot to say all at once, so maybe it's a good time for me to pause and respond to any questions or other areas that you'd like me to address today.
Well, I greatly appreciate the update. I know you said that was a lot, but let's just go ahead and dive right into some of the questions that we had discussed. So I'm going to defer to my colleague. She actually said she wanted to ask the first question to the congressman, so we're going to go ahead and let her ask the first question, and that'll kind of get us going in the business direction.
Well, yes, thank you, Congressman Rose, for joining us. I do have one question about small businesses, and really, is there any talk at all about additional assistance for small businesses similar to the PPP or the EIDL loan?
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion around that. If you kind of took an inventory of the bills before, you'd find a myriad of bills that have been introduced, many of them aimed at particular sectors of the economy or particular industries, some of them with a broader focus. And as I visit with small businesses and businesses generally across the district, what I hear is that, this has been, interestingly, a period of feast or famine, it seems. So there are certainly small businesses across the district that have experienced the best business environment that they've ever had. While curiously, maybe across the street in another industry or a business that serves another area of our economy, it's near total calamity, near total shutdown. And I think that really informs what we need to do next, in my opinion, is that we need to approach this more like a surgeon with a scalpel as opposed to a soldier with a broadsword. And unfortunately, I think many of the programs that we implemented back in the spring, including the CARES Act, were more of a broadsword approach, treating the entirety of the economy kind of uniformly. And I don't think that's what's called for from here forward. So as I look at what's out there, it seems to me that on the legislative front, the things that would make the most sense would be actions that, number one, would encourage businesses to get back to work. So I, for one, would favor a payroll tax holiday for a period of time. I think that would make a tremendous amount of sense in encouraging workers to come back to work, and also encouraging small businesses and helping them, broadly by reducing that cost for a period of time. So I think the president has been advocating that. I advocate for that. I think that's exactly one of the right proposals that we should do. Now, that's kind of a broadsword approach because it applies to everyone. It would apply to everyone equally. I think that there may be some, and I suspect that politically there's probably some impetus for some additional unemployment supplement from the federal level to what the states normally provide, though I'm not a big fan of that, frankly, and I suspect those of you in business are not a big fan of that. We certainly know that the $600 a week federal supplement to unemployment benefits that was provided back in spring with the CARES Act maybe was the single biggest mistake that we made, in my view. And I say we made it, the interesting thing about being in the House of Representatives, being in Congress, is that you get a whole list of binary choices to make. So you're either for it or you're against it. And the CARES Act is kind of a classic example of that. $2.5 trillion estimate at the time we passed it, $2.4 trillion. I think it's gone up a little since then in terms of what the estimated cost is going to be. But you were either for it or you were against it. You didn't get to go through and cherry pick that bill for the things that were good and the things that were bad. Fortunately, we had a few senators that recognized the mistake that was being made and called it out and tried to deal with it, but unfortunately, they were unsuccessful. And so we've endured now the pain of seeing employees deterred or encouraged essentially by that program to not come back to work. In some cases, see encouragement for them to hopefully get laid off, or hope to be laid off. And I suspect a lot of the people on the call today who are in small business have experienced the unwelcome circumstance of having their employees come to them and essentially beg to be laid off. And that's not a position anyone wants to be in. And of course, we can all understand why they why they would wish such, and the incentives that we created. We need to not do that again. And so, frankly, I think the proposals that plus up, as the Washington term, that provide this federal supplement to unemployment benefits, I think is an area we need to tread very lightly in. By contrast, I would just point this out. In the greatest recession in the history of the country since the Great Depression, 2008 financial downturn, I'm curious if anybody on the call today remembers what the federal government did then with respect to unemployment insurance. There was a supplement that was provided, federal supplement or a federal increase in benefits, but I suspect there wouldn't be too many people who would remember what that was. And again, at risk of sounding a little political, the Democrats controlled everything at that point. They held the Senate, the House, and the presidency. And guess what they did in the heart of the greatest recession that we had experienced up till that time? The increase in benefits. And I guess our call doesn't facilitate anybody being the Arnold Horshack in the room and jumping up. That's a real test for the younger folks who might not have been around back in the 70s. But $20. That's what the federal government did on the unemployment insurance side in the 2008, in the Great Recession, so to speak, or so-called. That's one of the things that's being looked at that I'm not real fond of. Perhaps there's a justification for doing something in that arena, but again, I would think very targeted. So my own view about what we should do is that we should, narrowly design whatever additional aid we give. Probably the thing that I've seen that I'm most fond of is to target that relief toward businesses that have experienced a dramatic downturn in their revenue. So there are a couple of different proposals that have been moving around in the House and Senate that would bring aid to businesses that have experienced a dramatic downturn in revenue, say in the neighborhood of 60 to 85% reduction in revenue, that those are the businesses that should be helped. I think it would make some sense to revisit the Paycheck Protection Program for a couple of reasons. Number one, to fix, I guess, what I would describe as a kind of a regulatory overreach by the Treasury Department, the Small Business Administration, in terms of how they overcomplicated the process of turning those PPP loans into grants. So I very much favor a very simplified approach to the particularly the smaller PPP loans. And I suspect, again, small businesses would agree with this. I think we build that as essentially a loan that would become a grant if you used it appropriately. And so I think we shouldn't go back on that promise, and we shouldn't allow the regulators to make that difficult. So if you had a PPP loan of, say, $150,000 or less, I think as long as you meet very minimal criteria, that should be treated as a grant at this point. I think the PPP program, while it was a little rough on the rollout, it was very helpful for many businesses. At least this is generally what I've heard. But we also have to keep in mind, at the time that we conceived of that program and implemented it, we thought this was going to be about an 8-week to 2-month situation, and it's obviously turned into something far different. And so that assistance was designed with the notion in mind that we were going to socially distance for 2 months and then get back to normal. That's not what has happened. And so I think that probably there needs to be some adjustments to the total amount that businesses can borrow. We already made some adjustments that spread out the period of time. Unfortunately, those adjustments came at the point that many businesses had kind of already done what we asked, which is to keep their payrolls intact for that 2-month period, when many of them were fully shut down and therefore unable to take broader advantage of that. And so as the partial shutdowns have continued on, I think it has changed the complexion. And so I think it would be appropriate to revisit the Paycheck Protection Program. Those are a few of the items that I mentioned. Obviously, it would be helpful if we could implement liability relief at the federal level. Frankly, I think that's a very heavy lift to get passed on the House side in particular, probably even on the Senate side. So I'm not sure there's going to be federal action on liability reform around COVID-19. Obviously, the state legislature has taken some badly needed steps in that regard last week. And frankly, that may be good for Tennessee because it puts us as a competitive advantage to those states around the country who haven't had the wisdom or good sense to implement similar liability protections for businesses and institutions. So that's a kind of a long-winded recap of what I see the legislative environment looking like right now. Hopefully I answered your question.
Yeah, Congressman Rose, that was something you mentioned, you touched on, and when Rebecca and I were studying this up, and I wanted to bring on some actual business owners, my friend Brett Akers, Kelly Fitzpatrick are on here as well, and you talked about businesses that took a significant decrease in sales because of people not going to work, and Brett and I had this conversation, and that's something I wanted you to hear from, was his perspective as the dry cleaners, how much it's impacted your business, and you've had to do things differently. So let's talk about that, how much revenue, it's decreased, so the Congressman knows, and hopefully we can work toward legislation that would help you and Kelly and businesses that are very similar to yours.
Sure. Kelly, you want to go first? Or?
Sure. Hi. First of all, thank you. This is great. My business, I do wholesale jewelry manufacturing. So we distribute all over the United States. About 20% of our business is direct to consumer, and then about 80% of our business is at the wholesale level. So when all of the main streets were shut down, basically that stream of revenue for us was completely cut off. We saw a huge upturn in our online sales because everyone was home and shopping online, which was great. But now we're starting to kind of see that even off. But for us, really, it was just a challenge to try to navigate. You know, what do we do when it's like this trickling effect of the business that we're getting is coming from, you know, this main street in Wyoming or in New York or wherever, and the regulations that were all over the United States were different, and we're just trying to navigate that has been the biggest challenge. But we are starting to see those stores purchase again, which is a good sign. And then also I opened an event space in the middle of all of this. So the wedding industry, which is our target market, same thing, just completely cut off from, you know, no one's planning a wedding right now. So I guess that's what I get for opening a wedding venue in the middle of a pandemic.
Though we do expect a baby boom, I understand.
Possibly.
Congressman Rose, appreciate your service and all that you're doing for small businesses, and it definitely was a godsend getting the PPP money. I was about to enter my big peak season, which similar to Kelly, we are a big prom. We do tuxedos and suits and rentals and things like that, weddings, our season. We do camps in the summer that got canceled because of the COVID-19. So we saw our business drop over half, and it was a shock. But the PPP money definitely helped us to kind of bridge that gap and you know, retain our employees. We did have to compete against the unemployment situation because our hours, our production of 5 days a week went to 3 days a week. So our hours dropped down. Then we got the money to kind of keep our employees, but yet we struggled to compete with the unemployment situation. So I know you talked about that, and it definitely was an issue for us. But so we've survived now, but yet we're still in this pandemic kind of situation where once the regulations and we started getting back to work, we did start increasing, but it's not like we're not back to norm. I was hoping by fall, you know, you keep thinking, you know, this is going to be over and we're going to get through it, but we're still kind of, you know, depending on what stats you read or believe or who's saying what or what politics is, it just seems like that we're still in this, we're just stagnant in terms of, are we going to be let loose, or we got to go back and shut, you know, restrain and so we're kind of in that limbo. And maybe it'll all be over after November elections. Who knows? But that's kind of where we are.
Well, thank you for those firsthand accounts. And as Britt knows, but I'll tell you the rest of you, I'm a customer of his, and so have continued to be through this period. Though I've used a lot fewer white shirts. You know, I put them on. You know, today I happen to be fully dressed, but there have been a number of times, and I suspect this is true for all of you who've worked through Zoom and other online venues over the last few months. But oftentimes, if you saw what I was wearing from the waist down, it didn't facilitate me needing to go to the dry cleaners very often. So, so that's, you know, that's I've talked with. You know, as I visited Britt's business, Kelly, I'm sure I won't even mention to my wife that you exist, and hopefully she won't figure that out, and we won't become a customer, although we may already be. I don't know. She does. She's watching Rebecca, so now I'm in trouble. Rebecca tells me so. You know, this is. I think your stories are really emblematic of what we see happening all across the U.S. economy and certainly our economy here in the 6th District of Tennessee. And I think it just really underscores how important it is that we get back to work. You know, at the end of the day, anything that the federal government, state government, local government does to try and ameliorate the impacts of a forced economic shutdown are going to be uneven at best and rife with abuse and failures to solve the problems, the fundamental problems. What we really want is to see our businesses be able to get back to work. And I will just say a word about the response to coronavirus, if you'll, and just as a reminder, and I think we all know this, but it's probably helpful to just remind ourselves about what the experts told us, but they continue essentially to tell us, though in some ways they've moved the ball on us. But if we go back to February, March, as we began to understand and appreciate that coronavirus was coming to us and how it might impact us, what we were told is that we need to flatten the curve. That term used to be used very often. You don't hear it used as much anymore. And we succeeded. I mean, it was a remarkable success. The goal was to flatten the curve. And if you'll remember why, it was so that we didn't overwhelm our healthcare services. And with a few noteworthy exceptions across the country, we achieved that goal. Certainly in Tennessee, I think we achieved it entirely. Never did we see our healthcare providers overwhelmed as was feared. A few areas around the country did experience that for a very short period of time. But other than that, we succeeded. The goal was not to stop the spread. And if you watch the media today, you might lose focus on that, because there's a lot of discussion about how if we do all the right things, if we lock ourselves in a bubble, that we could avoid the spread. But what we know is until we have a vaccine, and perhaps to some degree even after we have a vaccine, the virus is going to continue to spread. And our goal was and is to not overwhelm our healthcare providers in their ability to treat those who have adverse effects to the virus. What we've also learned is the vast majority of people who get COVID-19 have absolutely no symptoms. And a significant number beyond that have very mild symptoms. Now, that I don't say any of that to diminish the impact on those who are adversely severely affected, and there are many, and regretfully a number who've lost their lives and who will lose their lives from this virus. But that's no different than what we experience normally with respect to healthcare challenges that we face as a country. And so we've got to keep that in perspective. And so I just would note that. So the real answer to the dilemma that we face is how do we get back to work as quickly as possible? For those in my position, the goal in the meantime is to provide the measured help directed where it needs to most be directed at businesses that have experienced that real impact to allow you to survive and to be ready to return to full business when that opportunity to reopen the economy fully comes along, and in so doing, hopefully allow the economy to spring back in that so-called V-shaped recovery that you hear the economists talk about, where we go right back to where we were. The longer we stay shut down and the less targeted assistance that we're able to provide to help keep businesses who have been impacted through no fault of their own, right? I mean, that's the important thing to remember here. And I think as we think about the assistance that we provide to businesses, this is not a bailout like we've seen at times in the past when we rescue businesses and industries that perhaps had made bad choices, put themselves in a bad place, overextended themselves. That's not what happened here. You all were put in harm's way by the government imposing essentially a shutdown of the economy. And so I think it's appropriate for us to take actions to help ameliorate that harm.
Congressman Rose, one question I had was, when will we be able to go into the portal and kind of settle our accounts with the PPP money? I think October 1st is the date that we're supposed to make a count for it, but like I've done the program, got it all itemized out to where, I fit the criteria to have some forgiveness there, but I want to be able to do that, but talking to my bank representative, they're still not ready. Do you have any information on that?
Brett, regretfully, I don't have precise information, but we will get you that. I think there has been a little less impetus to get to that because there was a lot of uncertainty about how the program might evolve and how it might change. And so, understandably, I think everyone's a little bit reticent to rush out and start that process and then have the rules get changed, which of course, unfortunately, has already happened a couple of times. So I would say, I realize the anxiousness to get that behind you and get that resolved. We will take a step that will make that, for at least many businesses, if not most small businesses, a very perfunctory thing. That's certainly the goal. As you know, the initial application for conversion to a grant that Treasury and SBA came out with was quite burdensome, and we persuaded them. A number of members in the House and Senate worked to persuade them to come up with an easier form, which they did. So it's a little bit more streamlined than it would have been. But I think the goal at this point is to make it dramatically more streamlined, particularly the number that's been thrown around most often is for loans of $150,000 and less, to make those essentially become automatic grants. And so that's the goal. But if that doesn't happen soon, then obviously I realize you're going to have to start proceeding through that process. So our office will work on getting some clarity around that and try to provide that to you. And for those who are listening, we'll try to post something on our website that would direct you to or provide that information for you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Congressman Rose. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Brown. He's got the next question he would like to ask.
So good morning, Congressman. We appreciate you doing this. So, and I don't think we should have had you tell your entrepreneurial story. I don't know that a lot of people know the business you built and what you did and those kind of things. If everybody's okay with that, I'd like to hear you tell that story in 30 seconds because I don't think a lot of people know that. So.
Well, 30 seconds. So I'll give you the very abbreviated version. I'm not sure that's possible. I'm too, like everybody, I like to tell my own story, so it gets to be a long story. But I'm a lawyer by training. So let's go back to 1991-92 timeframe. I'm in law school at Vanderbilt University, and a fellow law school student and I had a business idea, which was to develop materials to help prepare individuals who were seeking their Microsoft certifications, professional certifications. And so we developed, essentially, to put it the smallest, I guess, version of this together, we developed the first practice exams for IT professionals who were attempting to get certifications from Microsoft. So some of you have probably taken the prep courses, or your kids have maybe for the ACT or SAT, depending on how old you are. We developed the first practice exam for Microsoft certification. In 1993, we introduced that product, and it turned out we were in a good place. Microsoft, their program flourished, and in the 1990s, we trained about 3.5 million IT professionals.
Yeah, so I again, like I tell the story of Kelly, a lot of people don't know about her businesses. I think people think of you as a country boy farmer, right? A lot of times, and have no idea what you did in the tech business. So I just always find that interesting. But one of the things, so opportunity zones. So I think this is something, I'm just dying to talk about anything but COVID at this point. Opportunity zones were launched. I think a lot of people thought it was going to be the savior for businesses in rural areas. And so something I would ask is, what we've seen is they've just not been used like anybody thought they would be, and especially not in rural areas. And so how do we, going forward, can we add some adjustments to that original legislation, maybe extend some of the sunset clauses and those kind of things? And then could we put some kind of extra incentive, because what we run into is the large investment groups that would, put $50 million into one of our opportunity zones. They don't even look outside of a city less than 1 million people. And then the other thing we get is, we can't even afford to do due diligence on less than $100 million. And, in our neck of the woods, there's no such thing as $100 million deal, right? Generally. And so that's something for you involved. I think the legislation, I think, was originally started just as you were elected, if I remember the timeline correctly. So.
Sure. So I arrived really after that, the 2017 tax reform legislation passed. And of course, I think everyone would agree that opportunity zones has been the concept has been successful, though a little uneven in terms of its application or where it's been successful. And we see this so often. And I think it's why groups like the one meeting today and Mr. Brown, your group are so important, is to help us figure out. So we would welcome your input on how we might tailor the opportunity zone concept so that it is more beneficial to rural and small communities than it has been. This is the problem, of course, with any of these programs, is that when you have government, engineering something, it's so difficult to get that right. And essentially, one way or another, you end up picking winners and losers, and that's just inescapable, I think. So I think that's why you have to be very careful with these programs, because it ends up, we end up putting our finger on the scale in a way that, as I think about the two small business people that we've heard from so far today, Kelly and Britt, I mean, these programs are at some level they help pay for them, right, through their taxes, and yet then they're unable to benefit from them. And that was true with our small business. I mean, we never our big break was that my business partner's father, his home and practice was wiped out by Hurricane Andrew, and the insurance settlement from that horrific storm ended up being the financing tool that we were.
That was your investment, huh?
That was our seed capital, right? So it's strange how those things work out, and I'm sure almost any small business person will have a similar type of story about how they were able to get off the ground. But in our case, it came in the form of a low interest loan from the father of my business partner, who only had the liquidity to make that loan because he had seen his personal property wiped out by a hurricane. So that was our story, and that's so often true. So I don't have the short answer. I will tell you, as you know, and I've already alluded to, I mean, getting legislation passed through the Congress is very, very difficult. I think opportunity zones is an area that's probably ripe for some adjustment.
Well, it does seem to be very bipartisan. I'll put it that way. How's that to be politically correct?
I think so. So getting something through, I think, and that's one of the delicate walks that has to be done in Washington, and you see this all the time. I mean, you have to be careful what one side or the other espouses. You can't get too far over your skis, because if the other side suddenly perceives that's a partisan issue, then they want to use that as leverage in the negotiations. And so, things that ought to be bipartisan, that we ought to all agree on, end up becoming stumbling blocks. And so this is one that's been bipartisan. I think the support for it has been. And so we need to be able to roll up our sleeves and make some of the little adjustments that could make it be more available to small communities.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to just ask your opinion. Obviously, we've got two entirely different entrepreneurs sitting here on this conference call. One more wholesale operation, and Britt, yours is more of that traditional brick and mortar. But I would think it'd be fair to say both of your operations probably are going to be changed significantly moving forward. From the federal level, when you are in your meetings and in discussions in Washington, do you have any insight on how you think business as a whole is going to change in the future because of what all we've gone through over the last few months?
Well, I mean, gosh, if you had that ability to see the future, you'd be in a good spot. I think the trends that I see are probably not unlike what you see, and you may have a better grasp of than even I do. I mean, obviously, the way that we do business will probably be changed. I'm a very big believer, just from my 55 years on the planet, to believing that change, though, is almost always evolutionary and not revolutionary. There are certainly inflection points, and this is no doubt going to be one of those inflection points where things may speed up a little, or it may help us bring into focus a little more clearly how things are going to change going forward. But I think that anybody that predicts that, brick and mortar is gone, I would be careful to write that obituary just yet, because I think that, the truth is we're social beings, and that's just hardwired into us. That's not going to go away, frankly. And frankly, as I visit with communities around the district, I see there's a yearning for people to get back into contact with one another. And so I don't see brick and mortar going away, but certainly the world beyond belongs to those who innovate. And so you've got to be looking for the opportunities. No doubt, one of the big, when we look back on this time, a year from now, 5 years from now, we will see a whole raft of new businesses that will have been born out of coronavirus. And the entrepreneurs who have their finger on that pulse and are able to see that, and no doubt we'll see many who try and fail, which is just the way it is. That's the great beauty of the American free enterprise system. And I hope we don't do anything to squelch that, because that's what, both of these two small business people have seen opportunities and seized on them, and their businesses, I know, have evolved. I've watched Britt's business evolve over time, and the focus of what he does change, and that will no doubt continue. And to be successful, that will have to continue. And so that's a long-winded answer to, I have no idea.
Well, and one thing I would say that I think we've seen that's been really fun, I guess is not the right word, but interesting to watch is how people innovated, and telemedicine is a great example. This should have happened 10 years ago. The technology's been around forever, but regulations and Medicare rules and Medicaid rules stopped it from happening. So COVID forced them to loosen those rules up, and it's been one of the greatest successes ever of innovation, right? And so that, I just think that's an interesting story of what we're talking about, that hopefully those regulations will stay that way now that it's proven that it works.
And maybe, this could be the bane of some people's existence, but I just think of my wife. She recently had a doctor's visit, and she came home and she was very frustrated because she didn't learn, not unlike many times we are when we visit our physician, but she came home and was very frustrated by one of the answers that she got that didn't seem to make sense. And so, but because it was a telemedicine visit, she had communications information for the physician. And so over the weekend, she emailed her physician, and lo and behold, on Sunday night, she gets an answer back from her physician, and a real dialogue takes place between them, and she gets her answer in a way that she would have just simply not been possible in the pre-telemedicine world. And so she comes away very satisfied with that experience. But it was because, as you aptly point out, that we've kind of opened up the world, and that is frankly a problem with the federal government. I would just say, the answer over and over again that I see is that we need to get the federal government out of the business of regulating businesses and picking winners and losers, because it really stifles innovation.
Yeah, we have an interesting, one of the big healthcare operations in our region is an ophthalmology operation. And so they've tried to do telemedicine for years because in our region, and he says, the one thing that people have if they're getting in touch with us is we tell them to drive an hour and a half from Byrdstown to Cookeville. And guess what? The reason they're calling us is they can't see. And so let us do telemedicine, right?
Well, Congressman, Ms. Rebecca said I had to keep you on a tight schedule because you're busy today. So as we wrap up, I would like to just ask, with the people that are watching, the people that are here, what's the one big advice you would give to a small business owner right now? Because you've been a small business owner going forward. What's the one advice you would give them?
Oh my, one thing. So I would just say, be listening to your customers try to hear what they're saying to you, try to observe how they're reacting to you, because, obviously serving them, serving their needs, addressing their demands is what's going to keep you in business. So I realize it's hard to do that when you're in the day-to-day grind of operating your business, and we all tend to get very focused on doing it the way we think it needs to be done. But if you can pull yourself back and think about what's working, what are my customers responding to, how are they interacting with me, and how can I meet them where they want me to meet them and provide them with what they want. I mean, that's obviously the key. And don't be ashamed or bashful about looking at your competitors and imitating the things that they do that are successful. I mean, that's part of the key to being a successful small business person, is be shameless in stealing the good ideas when you can find them.
Well, I greatly appreciate that. Thank you for taking the time to do this town hall with us today. Anything else we need to add or ask? All good? Well, thank you for taking the time to do this. I know you have a busy schedule. Rebecca and I were discussing that earlier, that she had you a jam-packed day. So thank you for taking this time out to do this and listen to our business owners and some of us in our roles that we can help go forward. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for doing this again. I can't say thank you enough, but we're grateful for it. So thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's a privilege representing you in the U.S. House, and don't be afraid for those listening to reach out to our offices or to me. We have an office in Cookeville. Rebecca Foster is our district director. Over in the western end of the district, in the Gallatin area, we have Ray Render, who's a TTU alum himself and works out of our Gallatin office. And of course, many of you know Bonnie Warren, who works in the Cookeville office, and Kim Mash, who has a similar role over in Gallatin, and then Van Hillary, our chief of staff. So we're all available to answer your questions, and I'll try to get an answer to the one that we got earlier about the PPP loans, Britt, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, sir.